The year is 988, and in the heart of Constantinople, the most powerful city on earth, something extraordinary is happening. The Byzantine Emperor, ruler of millions, surrounded by marble palaces and golden domes, makes a decision that will echo through history. He looks past his own people, past the Roman legions that built an empire, and places his life in the hands of warriors from the frozen north. Vikings, the very men who had terrorized Europe for generations, would now stand as the ultimate symbol of loyalty and honor. But how did the most feared raiders in history become the most trusted guards of an empire? The story begins not in Constantinople, but in the mist-covered fjords of Scandinavia and the rivers of what we now call Russia. For decades, Viking adventurers had been pushing east, driven by that restless hunger for glory, gold, and something greater than the life they knew. These weren't just raiders anymore. They were traders, mercenaries, explorers. They called themselves the Rus, and they carved out kingdoms along the great river routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea. They weren't running from their past as Vikings. They were evolving, adapting, becoming something new. And in doing so, they caught the attention of the Byzantine Empire. Now, Byzantium in the 10th century was a paradox. It was the richest, most cultured civilization in the Christian world, yet it was constantly under siege. Enemies pressed from every direction. Arabs from the south, Bulgarians from the north, rival claimants from within. The emperor's greatest fear wasn't always an external threat. It was the dagger in the dark, the poison in the cup, the general who got too ambitious. Byzantine politics were brutal. Emperors were overthrown, blinded, murdered. Trust was the rarest currency in Constantinople, more valuable than all the silks and spices flowing through its markets. And that's where the Vikings came in. Emperor Basil II, a man history would call the Bulgar Slayer, faced a crisis. A civil war threatened to tear his empire apart, and he needed soldiers he could trust absolutely. Not Romans who might have political loyalties, not local troops who could be bribed or swayed. He needed outsiders, foreigners who had no stake in Byzantine politics, no family connections to exploit, no emperors to replace. He needed men whose loyalty could be bought, and, once bought, would hold. So he turned to Prince Vladimir of Kiev, leader of the Rus, and struck a deal. Send me 6,000 of your best warriors, and in return, you'll have my sister's hand in marriage and the blessing of an empire. Vladimir agreed, but there was a catch. He had to convert to Christianity, and so he did, bringing his entire kingdom with him in one of history's great religious transformations. But that's another story. What matters here is what he sent south. 6,000 Varangians, that's what they called themselves, from an Old Norse word meaning sworn men, oath takers. They arrived in Constantinople like a force of nature, tall and fair-haired, carrying long axes that could cleave a man in two, shields painted with the symbols of their clans. They didn't speak Greek, they didn't understand Byzantine etiquette, but they understood one thing perfectly: the oath. In their culture, an oath sworn was sacred, bound not just by honor, but by the gods themselves, and later by the Christian God they had adopted. Breaking an oath was the worst sin imaginable, worse than death, and that made them perfect. The emperor placed these warriors around himself, in his throne room, outside his bedchamber, on the battlefield. They became known as the Varangian Guard, and their reputation grew with every passing year. While palace guards from other units might plot and scheme, the Varangians remained above it all. They had no interest in who ruled Byzantium, only in keeping their oath. Stories spread of their ferocity in battle, how they would form a shield wall and advance like an unstoppable tide, axes singing through the air. They became celebrities in a way, exotic and dangerous, admired and feared in equal measure. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. These weren't just mindless warriors following orders. The Varangian Guard became a destination, a career path for ambitious young men from Scandinavia and later from Anglo-Saxon England after the Norman Conquest. Joining the Guard meant wealth beyond imagination. The pay was extraordinary, 3 times what a regular soldier earned, and they had the right to plunder the imperial treasury whenever an emperor died, a practice called the palace pillage. Men would serve for years, accumulate fortunes, and return home as legends. We know some of their names. Harald Hardrada, who would later become King of Norway and die trying to conquer England at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, served in the Varangian Guard. He fought in battles across the Mediterranean, from Sicily to Jerusalem, earning a reputation that preceded him for the rest of his life. The Guard lasted for centuries, evolving as the world around it changed. After 1066, when William the Conqueror seized England, dispossessed Anglo-Saxon nobles and warriors fled east, many joining the Varangians. The Guard became a melting pot of northern warriors, united not by blood, but by that ancient oath and the promise of gold. They served through the Crusades, standing watch as Christian and Muslim armies clashed for control of the Holy Land. They witnessed the slow decline of Byzantium, the gradual loss of territory, the internal decay. But through it all, they remained loyal. There's something deeply human in this story, something that transcends the clash of swords and the weight of gold. These were men who left everything behind, sailed into the unknown, and found purpose in service to an empire that wasn't their own. They could have betrayed that trust 1,000 times. They could have seized power, taken the throne, carved out kingdoms for themselves. But they didn't. Not because they weren't capable, but because the oath mattered more. In a world built on betrayal and ambition, they chose loyalty. And that choice, repeated day after day, year after year, century after century, became legendary. The Varangian Guard finally faded from history in the 13th century as Byzantium itself crumbled. But their legacy endures, not just in chronicles and histories, but in what they represent. The idea that honor can transcend culture, that loyalty can be forged between strangers, that the fiercest warriors can become the most trusted protectors. They remind us that identity is not fixed, that Vikings could become guardians, that raiders could become heroes, and perhaps most importantly, they show us that even in a world of chaos and violence, some oaths are kept, some promises endure, some stories never die.